I want to thank everybody for being here. Just so you know, there will be questions or time for questions afterwards. I think some of you may have received note cards and paper to have questions. Brittany also has some more if you've got any questions. She'll be collecting them, and we'll have some time at the end to answer the questions, and then afterwards Howard will be signing books and selling books over in the corner there. I'm really excited to be here, and I wanted to welcome you all. When I read that book, I was stunned. Howard in this book answered questions that I didn't even know I was asking. This book really is a way to think about, you look backwards, you look forwards. When I read this book, I had all sorts of epiphanies. As you know, I do things, I talk about my dad all the time, and I thought I'd figured out most of the things. But reading the book, things came to me that I never knew. The questions he asked and what Elie Wiesel could answer really spoke to me. And yet at the same time, yesterday we were at a family party, and a family member by marriage who's reading the book said to me, Nancy, when I was reading this book, it occurred to me that this also occurs to you, and that you're going through some of these things. And so I say this to any of you, to the survivors in this group, to the family members in this group, to everybody in this group. We all have a past. We're all a product of our parents and our grandparents. And so I really think this book speaks to everyone, not just the survivor community. A couple things that weren't mentioned. He's my cousin. So I always talk about my father's side. Howard's actually from my mother's side. His great-grandfather and my great-grandmother were brother and sister. So in Jewish, it means we're family. People say, first cousin, second cousin, who cares? Especially with the Holocaust, we're family, and that's the only relationship that matters. Howard's first book, or one of the books about this, he wrote, was called The First and Final Nightmare of Sonya Reich, which is about his mom. And he was the scholar in residence at Congregation Shalom in 2006. He also came back to Milwaukee in 2010 when the movie was made about the book by Potemkin, and it was shown at UWM. So I'm very excited to welcome Howard back to Milwaukee. I met Elie Wiesel when he was here in 2006. He was here, and I asked him to sign a book, and he reluctantly signed a copy of Night, which I treasure like you would not believe. How did you get to meet Elie Wiesel?
That I met Elie Wiesel was one of the biggest surprises. That we became friends was even a greater surprise. I never thought I would meet him. In fact, when the book about my mother came out, which is Prisoner of Her Past, my publisher then tried to get a little blurb from Elie Wiesel for the back of the book. They couldn't get to him, so it was impossible. In 2012, the Chicago Tribune, where I've worked my entire career, gave one of its annual prizes. Each year, the Tribune gives out a Tribune Literary Prize. And in 2012, the Tribune decided the prize would go to Elie Wiesel. I'm out on a story, as I always am. My phone rings, it's my editor. Should I answer? Well, I'll answer. I answer the phone. He says, when are you coming to the office? I said, maybe Tuesday. I want to run something by you. He said, the winner of this year's Tribune Literary Prize will be Elie Wiesel. That's all he had to say, because I knew what that meant, or at least part of what that meant. What that meant was that I would be sent to New York to interview Professor Wiesel, write a big story in the Tribune, and then a couple of weeks later, he and I would have a public interview in Orchestra Hall in front of an audience of nearly 3,000 people. One minor problem. I'd never read a word Elie Wiesel had written. The Holocaust has always been a very difficult subject for me, and I imagine for all of us second generation, for anyone really. But when you're growing up with two parents who are Holocaust survivors, who are obviously very shattered by that, when your few uncles and aunts are Holocaust survivors, to me, this was like a radioactive subject, and I mostly avoided it, except on the rare occasion when the Tribune would ask me to write a story related to that, or when I wrote the story about my mother. I had to do some fast reading. So in the next couple of weeks, I read as much of Elie Wiesel's work as I could, including Night. I went to New York, I visited him, and it was awesome. I'm going to meet Elie Wiesel. I couldn't believe it. I came to his office. If you would come to his office in New York, it was like being in a library. Books, floor to ceiling, all down the hallway. Books. We went to his private little corner office in that suite. We sat kitty corner to each other. The coffee table was stacked this high with books. You certainly couldn't have put a cup of coffee on it. And we began talking. And I now realize in retrospect that we became friends about 4 minutes into that conversation. I didn't know it at the time. But he said to me, I want to show you something. And he walked across the room to his desk, and he took out a little tablet of paper, came over, sat next to me, and he said, I've never shown this to anyone on the outside, certainly never to any journalist. And he said, this piece of paper, this little tablet of paper, recently had surfaced. It was reflections on mysticism in Hebrew prayers that he had written when he was 13 years old at the time of his bar mitzvah. And because his sister had recently died, this document had surfaced, and this document had survived, and most of his family and most of mine had not. That began, I now realize, our friendship, because he was taking me on the inside. He knew by this point that I'm the son of survivors, that he and my father were both liberated from Buchenwald on April 11, 1945. And so what to another journalist might have been the beginning of a conversation, it was as if we were on third base going home already. We already had so much shared history. We spoke for almost an hour, for over an hour and a half in his office. Every 15 minutes, the assistant secretaries were knocking. There's a phone call. There's a president on the line. No. We kept on talking. And then came the event in Orchestra Hall. You couldn't get a ticket for this in Chicago. People were calling me. How can I get a ticket? What can I give you to get a ticket? It's Chicago style, you know. So I said, I've got one seat for this. On stage with Elie Wiesel. I can't do anything for you. We had our big event, and I'll never forget, my wife Pam and I arrived early at Orchestra Hall for the sound check, and we're waiting for Professor Wiesel to arrive, by plane, and then all of a sudden the buzz went in the building. He's in the building, Elvis is here. Everyone's excited. And so I went up to him, I said hello to him. We were in a big room with all the big Tribune editors. And then I decided I was going to leave the room because I don't want to talk to him now. I want to save it for the stage. So I just disappeared. 20 minutes later, they call me. It's time to go on stage. He and I are waiting backstage. He said to me, where were you? He says to me. I said, I was having a candy bar. He said, yeah, you were having a drink. This is what he was like. We went on stage. We had a spectacular, beautiful interview. It felt like it went by in 2 minutes. Then Pam and I took him to the airport. The limo driver was driving. We were in the back seat with him. We were waiting for his plane to be ready, and he was getting ready to go. He said, we hugged him, we said goodbye, we thanked him, and I thought that was the end of this remarkable, beautiful 5-week chapter of my life. I met Elie Wiesel, I talked to him. And as he was getting to leave, he said to me, you've got my number, right? And I said, you mean your phone number in New York? He said, yeah, you've got my number, right? And I said, yeah. And then he went off on the plane. And I was left thinking, what did he mean by that? What did he mean by that? Did he mean I'm supposed to call him and ask him how he is? And so I thought about that for the next week. What did he mean by that? And then another week went by, and I'm still thinking, did he mean I'm supposed to call him? And finally, on Friday night, almost 2 weeks later, I'm at the Orchestra Hall, where 2 weeks before we were on stage, and it occurred to me, this is a book. Our conversation, 2 generations, the Holocaust. We must continue this conversation. So I called him on Monday. By now it was 2 weeks and a day later. I didn't know if he would even remember me. I didn't even know if he would, presidents and prime ministers are trying to get to him. Will he remember me? I called, got through the various layers, and he comes on the phone, and the first thing he said to me was, I've told many people about you. I thought, whoa, he remembers me. And I told him this idea of this book, and he said, the only question is time, which I believe he meant his lack of it, because he's in so demand. And I said, well, we already have 2.5 hours of interviews. How hard could this be? He said, okay, come visit me. A month later, I was in Florida. He taught all winter in Florida because he didn't like being in the cold in New York. And that began our 4 years of conversations. Even when I met him in Florida, I didn't know if he'd remember me. Because when we met in the lobby of his hotel, I certainly remember what he looks like. It didn't matter. We sat down and we were talking, the tape recorder was rolling, and that process went on for 4 years.
Wow.
That's how it happened.
So I understand Wiesel didn't do any editing of the book. Was that unnerving, exciting?
Well, what happened was, so we spent 4 years doing these interviews. So then I had a new problem. I had 2 Manhattan-sized volumes of transcripts. And how do I turn this into a book? It's a mountain of words. And when you ask someone a question, they answer part of it, and then they talk about something else, and then they come back, or a month later they come back, and I had to try to put this jigsaw puzzle together. So I studied the transcripts, I found the themes that we talked about, I broke them up into chapters, I wrote the book. So now I had made a vow to him, a promise to him at the beginning, unsolicited. I said to him, no one will see this book before you do. Not my wife, not my agent, no publisher. You see it first. Good. So the book was done. I FedExed it to him. I had to FedEx it to him under a pseudonym because his fame was such that he could not travel under his own name. In a hotel, he had to be under another name. I hoped it would get to him. It did. And then he said, come see me in 2 weeks, and we'll go over it. So 2 weeks go by. I arrive again in Florida, and now I have some trepidation. It's 4 years. Did I get it? Did I miss it? Did I blow it? How did I do here? I'm about to get my grade from Professor Wiesel. So again, we meet in the lobby, we embrace, and I notice he is not holding the manuscript, which I think is not a great sign. So we go to sit down in chairs just like this, almost exactly the same distance. We have a few pleasantries. How are you? How are you? What have you been doing? How's the weather? Blah, blah, blah. So then I had to bring it up. I mean, I'm not going to come here and not bring it up. I said, so would you like to go over the book? And he said, no. So I said, wouldn't you like to, go over the book, look at it? He said, no, very good, nothing to change. That was it. That was the editing process. Now, I had reserved a week in Florida to go over this book with him. So instead, I sat with him by a week by the pool talking. And we just continued our conversations, only this time the tape recorder wasn't going. So at that point, I was kind of thrilled and disappointed. I was thrilled that I'd passed the test, that it was fine with him, and I still was looking forward to the process of working, word choices, moving chapters around. No, that's not what I said. Why did you put that in? Take it out. Nothing like that. The book was done. And then I came home, I fine-tuned it, and then a few months later, I found out that, as you all did, that Professor Wiesel had died. He was 87 years old, and I was shocked. I was shocked. He was 87. Maybe I should not have been shocked, but he had such vitality and interest and curiosity in the world. I always unconsciously presumed that our conversations would just keep going and going for years on end. We talked about other things we would do, and suddenly I and the rest of the world no longer had him. But at the same time, I feel so grateful, very fortunate, that he saw that manuscript, that I know what he thought about it, that he was okay with it, that he said it was very good, because otherwise I would be left wondering. So that was the editing process with Professor Wiesel.
I'm just grinning like a proud relative. So your parents didn't talk about the Holocaust. As you know, my dad did. Those are the two extremes that I've experienced, all or nothing. In the book, you say, I came to realize relatively late in life, the Holocaust never really ended. I know I'm still fighting the Nazis. If you are a child of a survivor, the story is always there with you. Whether you recognize it or not, acknowledge it or not, discuss it or not, it hovers over you, it follows you. It's up to us, however, whether we try to confront it or hide from it. There's many children of survivors in this room. There's quite a few survivors here. What would you tell us, and what would Elie Wiesel tell us?
Well, one thing I learned is never to presume what Elie Wiesel would say, because whatever I would ask him, it would be something different. But Elie Wiesel, in my experience with him in those 4 years, had great respect, both for those survivors who did speak about it, and also for those who did not. I think he heard in their silence, in my parents' silence, their testimony. I think he wrote in one of his books that if he gathered together all the survivors and between two mountains, he would not be surprised if they would not necessarily tell the world, that silence would ensue. He respected other people's way of dealing with this subject. What's remarkable, among many things about Elie Wiesel, was he was one of the first to speak about it. He told me that he promised himself, after he was liberated in 1945, that he would not write about this for 10 years. He said 10 years is a very important number. 10 is an important number in the Jewish tradition, he said, and that was true. In 1955 is when he wrote Night. And as we know, nobody wanted to publish Night. Francois Mauriac, the Nobel laureate, championed the book, finally got someone to publish it. It was a generation or two until the world really accepted it. But I believe that regarding the subject of speaking in the Holocaust or not speaking, I believe that Elie Wiesel gave us a template, a way of thinking about the Holocaust. Because as I'm sure many of you know, there was, it's hard to believe now, but there was a lot of shame and denigration placed upon survivors. A lot of blame was placed on survivors. And survivors, even in Israel, survivors were demeaned. The turning point, I believe, and Elie Wiesel believed, began in 1961 during the Adolf Eichmann trial. And that's when the world really heard in a big way, in a televised way, the testimony of survivors. And then the '67 war also changed it. Now the survivors, I think, are revered around the world. But that has changed over these past 60 years, and I don't think anyone did more to change that than Elie Wiesel with the words that he wrote and the places that he spoke.
In the book, you said that Wiesel rejected despair, that despair is a choice. He understood grief, sadness, sorrow, yet we must keep living. My dad always said, I won, I survived. But Wiesel didn't call himself an optimist, he called himself a pessimist. And the book is called The Art of Inventing Hope. Can you talk about Wiesel's Act of Pessimism?
Yeah, so Professor Wiesel, it was one of the first things he said in that first interview we did in New York, and I said, so are you optimistic, are you pessimistic? And he said, I'm pessimistic. And I was really struck to hear him say that, because I always viewed him, as we often all do, as this inspiring figure of hope and optimism. I said, you're pessimistic? He said, yes, he said, but it's an active pessimism. So the act of pessimism, what is that? I never even heard of that before. One of his inventions. He said, it means that you don't give up. It means that the harder they resist you, the harder you struggle to be heard. He said to me, sometimes I think all I ever do is protest. He said, you protest even if you get nowhere, because he told me once he spoke at the United Nations, and the title of his speech has the world changed? And he said, what is the answer? No, the world has not changed. But he says he feels he needs to speak, if only to protest, if only to know that you do protest, as only as a definition of who you are. He also said to me, and this is how the title of the book comes from, he said, my job is to provide the art of inventing hope, hope inventing instead of despair. He said not only did he reject despair, he believed that the survivors rejected despair, not only after the Holocaust, but during the Holocaust, by trying to survive, by coming to new countries, by learning languages, by having children, by having grandchildren. These were rejections of despair. He said, if you accept despair, that is the wrong answer. He said, despair is not an answer, it's a question. And of course, he answers all questions with other questions. But I think if I had to sum up, I would say Professor Wiesel was right on the precipice of hope and despair. And he decided, I choose hope.
One of your chapters is called A Burden and a Privilege. And I've used the word burden all my life. Many of us in this room have that burden and carry that weight. One of the epiphanies that came to me when I was reading your book, in my family, my dad used to say, you cause me much joy. And we sort of made fun of my father because it caused me much joy was bad grammar. We always thought that, well, come on, Dad. Anyway, but reading your book, for the first time, I think I got it, we literally caused him joy. Just by existing, we gave him joy where there was no joy before. And I didn't get that until I read your book. So anything that...
Yes, definitely, because I would tell him that a lot of us children of survivors feel guilty. We feel guilty about what our parents went through. We feel guilty about how little we can do to ameliorate what they went through. We feel badly about their stuff. He said, I reject that. You should have no guilt feelings. Only the guilty should have guilt feelings. He said, and I said, what if we don't feel we did enough? He said, just by being, you did enough. Just by being. He would say, you are our hope, you are our joy. He feels, and he says, some survivors decided they wouldn't want to have children. Why bring Jewish children into this world where they're rejected? But he said most did not. Most did have children. And that was their affirmation of hope. And so he He felt that the children of survivors are paramount of importance. He felt that the Nazis were trying to kill the children above all, because the children are the future. The parents are the past, the children are the future. And he said that resonates with Jewish history, that Hitler was not the first one to try to kill the children, as we know from Passover stories and Haman and whatnot. He found great hope in the children of the survivors, and he said he was surprised by how the children of survivors conducted themselves. He said he didn't think they would take up this cause as much as they have. He didn't expect, he said they go beyond what he expected. He said he could see children saying, I've had enough, tell me, I'm sorry you suffered this, enough, close the story, move on. He said that's not what children of survivors doing. And he was, I think, one of the great satisfactions of his life was what he saw the next generation doing. I think that was a surprise to him, and it was very meaningful to him.
One of the other things Wiesel said is to listen to a witness is to become a witness. And I know when I talk to schools, I use that line all the time. When I talk to schools, it's not the history lesson I give, it's the lesson to the students that now that they're a witness to it, that they've heard the speaker, my father, they've got to go out and tell the truth in the world. But at the same time, he also said, only those who were there can know what it was meant to be there. Explain the discrepancy.
So one thing that I think Professor Wiesel loved, that I learned in these 4 years, is paradox and contradictions. He loved those. It's in the Jewish Talmudic tradition. He said, simple answers don't appeal to me. It doesn't, he said, if he said you could just, he said many people ask him, why do you still believe? Why still believe in God afterward? He said, it's very easy to say, I don't believe, that's fine, a simple answer. I don't want a simple answer. To him, it was all about the struggle, all about the quest. He did agree that, he did write that to hear a witness is to see a witness, but I would ask him, if everything you've done in this 60 years you feel has done nothing to end genocide, why keep writing? And he said, what else, if there was something else for me to do, I would do it, but what else can I do? This is what I do. And he pointed to the example of Jews who wrote during the Holocaust under extremely severe circumstances. Emanuel Ringelblum in the Warsaw Ghetto, they wrote what happened and they buried it, and two of the collections were found. There's still some that have not been found. He cited the Sonderkommandos in Auschwitz who did the burning of the bodies, not the killing, the burning of the bodies. They wrote. Some of those testimonies have survived. And he said, if they wrote, if they could write under those circumstances, then I have to write too. And so I think he felt, even though he felt language cannot adequately express what happened, it's what we have and what we have to use. And that's why he was a great believer in writing, a great believer in storytelling, in memory, in documenting, and no matter what the odds, he felt we must continue. Even if it seems we are failing, we must continue.
So there was many times when I read the book that I thought I was listening to my father. It was amazing how much, what he said really spoke to me. And one of the things that both Wiesel and my dad talked about is when something happens, to speak out immediately. That is the call to action, so to speak. What other calls to action would you say that we have for the future?
So this subject came up when I was speaking to Professor Wiesel about words. And I said to him, sometimes we're typing words that are on pieces of paper. What difference does it actually make? Have we changed anything? It just seems like these words and sentences and paragraphs and chapters and books amount to a pile of verbiage, a collection of verbiage. Against these cataclysmic events, it doesn't seem that consequential. But he believed that those words were of paramount importance, and that you had to document, you had to describe what happened. I lost my, what exactly were you asking me here again, please?
Just what is the call to action?
Oh yes, yes, of course. So he said that in certain moments, these words can take on the quality of actions, what he called moments of grace. It's not just that you type a word on a paper or say something, it's when you say it. He said when you're in a classroom, meaning he means during this era, and they said, it's time to kill your Jewish friends, that's when you say no. When someone is telling you that this is the right thing to do, when this is what your God says to do, that's when you say no. And he said in those moments, in those crucial moments when you can stand up, and moments of peril, that's when these moments, these words attain the quality of actions. And to him, it seems to me, those were not just words, those were the words that he lived by. Because ever since the Holocaust, he was a speaker about human rights. He was in South Africa arguing against apartheid long before it became fashionable to do so. He was championing Soviet Jews, trying to get them liberated, freed from the Soviet Union, long before they were able to, long before Sharansky came out. He was always putting his own safety and his own reputation on the line to do exactly what he said we should do. And that's the example I think he wished us to follow.
I think that speaks a lot to us, and just like we're all in this room, how do we go forward? This isn't just a talk about this really terrific book, but it's also what are we, each individual of us, supposed to do? And so I thank you for that.
Thank you. We have a moment now. What do we do now?
So I want to go back a little bit when you talk about the first book, The Prison of Her Past, from the film, and The Final Nightmare of Your Mom. Explain a little bit what's going on with your mom, maybe how come you were chosen to meet Elie Wiesel, and then I was fascinated by Elie Wiesel saying your mom's behavior was normal.
So I will back up a bit. I mentioned that I had not read anything by Elie Wiesel. So basically for the first 49 years of my life, I avoided the subject as much as I could. And then something dramatic happened. On the night of February 15, 2001, my mother, a Holocaust survivor who said almost nothing about this subject, was a 69-year-old widow in our house in Skokie, ran out of her house that night insisting someone was trying to kill her. She was roaming the streets of Skokie on a frozen February Chicago night. She was picked up by the police. She was brought to a relative's house. The next day brought home, she did it again. We did not know what that meant. I did not know. The psychiatrist who, bless you, the psychiatrist who interviewed her did not connect this with the most obvious source, her Holocaust childhood. When we finally got psychiatrists to visit my mother, they said she diagnosed her with delusional disorder. I looked that up in the DSM book, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Delusional disorders means you're having delusions. It tells you nothing. It took a year until I found a psychiatrist who'd been treating Holocaust survivors for 40 years, and he diagnosed my mother with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, what they call late onset. So the worst symptoms flashed out, and it was my wife, Pam, who figured out that the night my mother ran out of her house, February 15, 2001, was the exact 10th anniversary of the death of my father. The one person who was her protector and her safety. And the PTSD literature says that it's often an anniversary, a news story, a birthday, something that pushes you over into psychosis. So my mother was back in the Holocaust. My mother is now 88 years old. She believes to this day that there's a yellow Star of David on her clothes. To have that Star of David, of course, is to be marked for death. Now, when she first would tell this to me, I would tell her, no, that's not true. And she would become very upset. And I learned to stop doing that because I was denying her reality. I told all of this, what I just told you, in somewhat longer form to Professor Wiesel during that first meeting. And he said, what she's doing is quite normal. I thought, normal? I thought this was the most aberrant, strange thing. But I realized what he meant. It wasn't normal for me. It wasn't normal for society, but it was normal for her because that happened to her once. And if it could happen once, that she would be pursued for her life, why wouldn't it happen again? And so she was simply reliving what had happened to her once. The difference was, I didn't know what had happened to her. I didn't know her story. So I traveled to Poland, I traveled to Ukraine. I spent a year piecing together that story to find out what she was running from exactly. And I found out she had a family in Warsaw that she never told me about. I went to this little town she was from, Dubna, and this is what I found out. My mother was born in 1931. In 1939, the Russians invaded Poland from the east as Germans invaded from the west, dividing Poland, we know. And Russian soldiers took over the family house, and all the family members were pushed into the back room. My mother was 8 years old at the time. That is what she found out can happen when you're 8. 2 years later, the Nazis arrived on June 25, 1941, and executions began that day at the Jewish cemetery by Einsatzgruppe C, that the same group that famously executed thousands in Babi Yar. They went through Dubna on their way to Babi Yar. Of the 12,000 Jews who lived in Dubna when my mother was there, it's believed less than 100 escaped those executions. My mother is one of them. How she escaped, I don't know. I tried to put together the chronology as best I could in the book Prisoner of Her Past, and I sum it up a little bit in this book. That is what she was running from the night she ran out of her house on February 15, 2001, and that's what I did not know she was running from. And so really a subject that I've not talked about for the first 49 years of my life, now it's almost all I ever talk about. And that's my mother's status. She's in a nursing home a few minutes from our house. I see her every other day. She's happy when I come there, but she's very haunted, and she still believes everyone is trying to kill her. And there's nothing we can do to help her because she won't take any medicine. She won't talk to a psychiatrist. She believes everyone is trying to kill her, and she has every right to believe so because that was once the case.
As you know, Jim and I went to visit her recently, and my voice has caused me a lot of grief through the years. But she looked up and she said, "I know you." It was my voice. Yeah. So she recognized me.
Yeah.
One of the things I say is that I too spent a lot of time talking Holocaust when I never thought I'd be that kid. I say I've been dealing with death since the moment I was born. And I've heard you say that the most important event in your life happened before you were born. Given where we are coming from, are you hopeful?
I've always been a very optimistic person. When you look like this, you got to be optimistic. Whatever my second generation experience is, you know, it's a grain of sand compared to what the survivors went through, you know, so we have to keep that in perspective. And one of the things that makes me most optimistic and hopeful are the survivors themselves, and one particular survivor, George Kennedy, her father, my cousin. If you didn't know George Kennedy, I'm sorry. If you did, you are so fortunate. I saw him, I would say we both worked out at the same health club, but he worked out. There was never a time I didn't see a smile on George Kennedy's face. And he's in the book. I didn't mention him by name, but I said a cousin of mine who's a survivor says he goes to see all these movies, all the Holocaust movies. He doesn't miss one. I can't even sit through the trailer. It's too difficult for me. He could. He was optimism and hope. And people like him, people like Professor Wiesel, and the ability, the opportunity that I have to write, to get this out on paper, is what enables me to be hopeful despite all. That plus being married to Pam. Works every time.
So now it's our turn to tell the story. Many of our parents are gone. Those that are still alive will be gone, and I'll be an optimist when they're 120 years old. We tell the story differently. We tell it from a different point of view. We only hear the stories our parents shared with us. I know my father, he told the same stories. He has a handful of stories. Yeah. I've got it, on tape, 5, 6 different ways, but it's always the same thing. But we really don't know what happened. We only know the little bit that they've allowed us to peek into their lives. Jim and I were just in Normandy, and it's the 75th anniversary, and for the first time there's a big sign that says, "Remember." That wasn't there before. They too are feeling it's changing how the world is telling the story, what they're saying. What is our challenge? How do we make sure that what story gets out there?
Well, I asked Professor Wiesel once about forgiveness. And that's a subject that comes up a lot. People ask him, people ask others. And he said to me a sentence, it's in the book, I've never forgotten. He says, forgiveness is not relevant. He said, not forgetting is relevant. He says one of the most important words in Jewish tradition in Hebrew is zachor, remember, remember. He dedicated his life to the importance of memory. But I said, but will people remember? For instance, he said, we children of survivors, myself included, often are named after those who did not survive. And he believes those people and their stories and their lives are immortalized by these names. Nothing lives longer than a name. But I said, after one generation, 2 generations, the names kind of melt into a paragraph in a history book. He totally disagreed. First of all, anything I told him, he totally disagreed with. But he disagreed with that because he mentioned Tisha B'Av. He said, I can tell you what happened that day. I can tell you the names of the generals. I can tell you anything. He said, we Jews remember what happened 3,500 years ago. He said, you think we're going to forget what happened 70 years ago? I don't think so. He was optimistic about that. But at the same time, he worked to make sure we remember. And no matter where I go to speak about this book, no matter what city, what university, where I go, one or two or more people come up to me and say, oh yes, I heard him speak there, I heard him speak there. I think he may have reached as many people just by speaking as he did through his books. And so he was optimistic that the story, that what happened will be remembered. And if he felt that way, that's good enough for me.
I was thinking about how sometimes there's criticism that the people in the 1940s didn't fight back, that they didn't resist. But Elie Wiesel didn't say that. He said they resisted just by living.
This is one thing I brought up with him. This is, to me, the most injurious libel of this whole story, that Jews did not resist. First of all, yeah, they resisted by trying to live, they resisted by hiding, they resisted by escaping, they resisted by surviving Auschwitz. You could kill yourself very easily in these camps. You just went up to the wire, most did not. They resisted by living afterwards. They resisted in every single way. How do you resist, he said, when the mightiest military outfit in Europe is surrounding your ghetto and you have nothing and no one outside, or almost no one outside, will help you? What form of physical resistance would there be? And yet, there was resistance. We know the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and many other ghetto uprisings. So the question, Professor Wiesel says, is not why didn't they resist? The question is, why did they resist? Why did they resist against these monumental odds? And yet still they did. And then they said, and then who really then were the followers? Who really were the sheep following? Jews being forced to their deaths? Or entire German populations following this madman? Who really were the sheep following?
Wise man. I sometimes wonder about the times Dad didn't talk about. And you wrote that Wiesel couldn't ask his sister about what their mothers... Tell about that situation.
So I think, as I said before, mentioned before, this fits into it. Wiesel was extremely respectful of silence and of survivors' a choice to not speak. And he said in French, there's a word he saw called pudeur, a respectful silence. He said that if we children of survivors don't ask our parents about these details, it's a respectful kind of thing. There's some sacred subject. And he cited the ultimate example, which is when he and his family arrived in Auschwitz. And as we know, immediately there are the selections. And you go here or you go there. And Wiesel and his father were in one line, and his mother and two sisters in another. And Wiesel said he would not ask his surviving sister what was said as they were in that line in that selection. He would not ask, because that was something too sacred that you don't ask about. And I think that says a lot about him. This dovetails also with the subject of forgiveness that I mentioned earlier, because he would ask, people would ask, can you forgive? Can you forgive what happened? He said, I can't offer forgiveness for a whole people. Only the dead can offer forgiveness. Ask them.
Another thing he talked a lot about was humiliation. And I view humiliation as the other side of the coin of bullying. And I find that's something that's going on a lot today. Want to talk about it?
Yeah, because as we know, not only were Jews murdered en masse during the Holocaust, but they were tortured and humiliated en route to their deaths. It was not only to dehumanize them, but it was the belief by Nazis, and it's in their documents, that Jews were not human. Jews are subhuman. I've looked at these documents. Jews are referred to as vermin and bacillus to justify these killings. And humiliation was an integral part of this. And so Wiesel himself said that he found himself at a moment where he had to decide if after the war he would engage in humiliation. And he was in Israel, and he was somewhere, I can't remember where, but he was on a bus. And on the bus was one of the Blockaustester, one of the supervisors of a barracks in one of the camps. And now he was free. Now he could confront. Now he could humiliate. Now he could insult. And he said, he will not do that. I will not humiliate. Because I think to him, humiliation was the beginning of the road to dehumanization, which leads to genocide, which became the Holocaust. And he did not feel that even at that point he should take even the first step. And he said to me, when he talked about humiliation being such a big issue, I was surprised. I didn't understand. He said, humiliation, he feels, is one of the greatest issues of today. You do not humiliate anyone. And that was, I think, the reason. I think he felt it was the gateway to what happened last time.
I'm going to sort of wrap it up and say, Elie Wiesel was probably the face of the Holocaust, which he did not like and he did not want to be, but now he's gone. What do you think his most important legacy is?
So I will disagree with you the way he disagreed with me everything I said. Elie Wiesel is not gone. The Holocaust has not ended. I spent those 4 years with him. I hear his words every single day just as I hear my dad's voice. His books permeate our culture. I like to think that he is not gone. When he died, I was first shocked and saddened, and then I realized he's still with us. And as long as we read his books and we think of him, he is with us. He said this himself. He said to me, I asked him once, you know, we survivors, we children survivors, many of us do not have grandparents. I had no grandparents at all. What do we do about that? He said, if you have no grandparents, that means you have a surplus of love. You have to find somewhere else to place that love. Help somebody else. And he said another thing you can do is find out about your grandparents or somebody else in your family who did not survive. Find out about their life. Find out their story. Make that a special day. And he said in that way, those people are not gone. They're gone in a physical sense, he said, but not in a metaphysical sense. So if he feels that way about those who did not survive, that's how I feel about him. And if only because of night, I'll just say one other thing. I asked him, this is maybe a question we all have, why night? You know, why night? Why is this the book that the whole world reads after 2 generations didn't read it? Why this book? And I asked him, I thought, finally I'm coming to the oracle. I'm going to get my answer once for all. Sorry. He said to me, I don't know. He said, I wrote 60 books. The others are just as good as this. They're jealous of night and they haunt me in my dreams. But we have night, and I believe we'll have Elie Wiesel's words forever.
I think that's a great place. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you. That was great. They did it. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? You can hold that piece of paper up. While we're picking them up, is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have?
That I often ask that at the end of interviews too. No, I just want to say this is one of the great privileges of my life, and I realize that. And to spend these 4 years, I want to tell you, anytime when I would have an appointment with, on a more personal level, when I'd have an appointment with Elie Wiesel for 1 hour, he would stretch it to 2 hours. When I had an appointment for the morning, he would add an afternoon session. If I was going to be in Florida for 2 days, he'd ask me to stay for a third day. It just kept expanding. It kept expanding. And I thought, I don't know how or why I got to be so lucky, but I'm going to make the most of this that I can. And I feel so fortunate now that this is now in a book, because if not, what happened between us would be gone, would be ethereal, it would be forgotten. And now I have this document, and I just hope it'll be a help to children of survivors, grandchildren of survivors, and anybody else who believes in humanity.
So the first question from the audience, can you speak to Wiesel's understanding of the overlap between spirituality and history?
Wow, that is my next book. I will address it in a more personal way regarding what he said. I asked him if his personal family history is connected to his faith, his history. And he said, absolutely. He said he cannot separate those two. His father believed, his grandfather believed. He cannot not believe. It doesn't mean he doesn't struggle, but he decides he wants to deal with faith from inside the faith and not outside the faith. Now, at the same time, he said, I cannot consider Auschwitz in terms of religion, in terms of God, or not God. He does not, but he did point out that Auschwitz, he said, remember, did not come down from heaven ready-made. It was created by humans against other humans. But he said his personal history is inseparable from faith. And so I think we could extrapolate from that he sees the two, history and faith, being interwoven. If he says we know everything that happened to Jews going back 3,500 years, that's an embrace of both history and faith at the same time. So I would say a big yes.
Do you see any parallels between what is happening in America today to what happened in the Holocaust? And if you do, what can you do about it?
Okay, so
A wise one.
I do not want to be in the Elie Wiesel chair here, that's for sure. I think, without getting into political affiliations, I think it's inescapable that over the past 2.5 years, racism and bigotry to some extent have been legitimized in America. And hate crimes, including and especially against Jews, have shot up. Now, we all can come up with our own reasons for it, but that is inescapable. And I think Professor Wiesel believes, and I believe, that we must speak out against that. And we're seeing that in marches, we're seeing that in various contexts. But it's like it never went away. You know, the racism and the anti-Semitism never went away. It's just that the rock has been lifted and it can crawl out more. What we have to do is put the rock back down. And maybe in a year and a half we'll have an opportunity to.
As I say, register and vote.
Yeah.
What would you say is the most important lesson when teaching the Holocaust to students with seemingly little connection?
So what is the most important lesson? I don't consider myself a teacher. I speak about what I write. But we have to make sure that they know. I speak to college professors all the time. I did last night at this event. I was at a salon. I went, and the college professors that I spoke to last night said they were struck at the difference of knowledge of students today versus 20 years ago. And they say 20 years ago you could refer to these events of World War I, World War II. They knew. Now he said they know very little. He said they know all about science and math. That they're fantastic at. But history and humanities is what they don't know. And so the professor said what he's got to do is he's got to inform them. So I guess our job, yours, mine, and all of us, is to inform these young people as soon as we can. I think science and math, as Professor Wiesel might say, are taking care of themselves. We have to tell them the history and the humanity of what happened. Because I asked him, why did this happen? Why did this happen? He said, Professor Wiesel, I ask myself all the time, why? Why did this happen? And he said what was missing, because the Nazis, the generals, they were well educated. Many of them had PhDs. They could read Goethe and listen to Bach and Beethoven. They were educated, philosophical people. He said, what did they lack? Ethos. And he said, and Professor Wiesel said to me, that's why I go around the world and go to universities and talk about ethos. You must have classes in ethics. But that tied in with history, with what happened. Without that, we're lost.
Because of one of the first questions that you had about how so many hate crimes and how it's becoming almost normal, as far as mass shootings and things like that, how do you feel? I'm a person of color, my family's Mexican, but I have a huge respect for the Jewish community because of what happened during the Holocaust and how the strength that you all have to proceed afterwards. Well, how do you feel about these ICE camps that hold people in inhumane conditions where people aren't getting food, water, and some people are even dying in these camps, and a lot of people compare them to concentration camps or internment camps that happened to the Japanese after Pearl Harbor? So
I feel, as probably everyone else in this room feels, it's inhuman, unacceptable, un-American, and just inhuman. And it's shocking to see that this can still happen. And I know there's been a great debate about whether you should call this a concentration camp or not. Call it what you want. It's an inhuman, unacceptable situation. And as Nancy said, there's only one way to change that, by registering and voting. But I am grateful and in awe of you for coming here and being here with us and saying what you said. And I can only thank you. Thank you.